President Trump unveiled the Republican plan for overhauling the tax code this week, calling it a once-in-a-generation opportunity. But there are already serious questions about who benefits from the plan and how much it will add to the deficit. We want to discuss that now with the Director of the Office of Management and Budget, Mick Mulvaney. Before we get to Tax Reform Director Mulvaney, I want to ask you about the Tom Price travel controversy, because you sent out this memo on Friday to all executive agency heads saying that they now need prior approval from the White House Chief of Staff to fly on a government or private plane. And you added this: every penny we spend comes from the taxpayer. Just because something is legal doesn't make it right. Question: why did you feel the need to write that?
I thought it was the clearest way to articulate what the president believes, and one of the reasons, or at least the reason behind why the president was so upset about what happened with Mr. Price. By the way, I got that memo from the lawyers, and it was fairly sanitary. It was very legalese, and those are the two sentences that I added just to make it explicitly clear that this is the policy. Just because it's legal doesn't mean it's right. My guess is, and there's ongoing investigations in a couple of different administration agencies right now, we'll find out that all of this travel was entirely legal. The question is whether or not it's right, and I think that's the lens that the president wants to look at this travel through, not just whether or not it follows the law.
Well, as I discussed with the panel, Tom Price isn't alone. I want to put these pictures up on the screen again. At least 3 other members of the cabinet, as well as the head of the EPA, have all taken either private and/or government flights. They say they needed to get where they were going in a hurry, and they got approval from their agencies. Are they in trouble?
Let's be clear. There are absolutely times where this type of travel is appropriate. I think if you look at some of the places specifically that Secretary Zinke went, there is no commercial service there. In fact, there's no commercial service anywhere near where he was going, and I think that was the case in many of the occasions. The question is just this, is that are we doing the best that we can to be good stewards of the taxpayer dollars? Are these particular choices, the private charters, the military flights, are those the absolute last options that we go through or get to? And I think that's what you'll see. It was unfortunate what happened with Dr. Price, but the president is telling everybody it's not going to happen again.
Well, let me ask you a direct question, because you're now at a conference in Canada where we're talking to you from. Please tell me that you flew commercial.
Not only did I fly commercial, I paid for it myself. It's not a conference. I'm up here visiting a college with my son.
Oh, okay. I had that wrong. So that's all self-funded.
Yes, sir.
Okay, good. Let's turn to the tax reform plan that the president and Republicans in Congress rolled out this week. The president told Americans who benefits.
By eliminating the tax breaks and special interest loopholes that primarily benefit the wealthy, our framework ensures that the benefits of tax reform go to the middle class, not the highest earners.
But Director Mulvaney, independent experts say what the president just said there isn't true. I want to put up this chart. The Nonpartisan Tax Policy Center did this analysis. It shows the middle fifth of households in America, those earning between $48,000 and $86,000 a year. They'll get an average tax cut of $660 next year. Meanwhile, the top 1%, people making more than $730,000 a year, will get an average tax cut of almost $130,000 next year. Now, I understand that this isn't done yet, that they're only basing it on the plan as it exists at this point. But according to their analysis, that middle fifth gets 1.5% of the total benefit of the tax cut, while the top 1% gets 8.5% of the benefit. That doesn't seem fair.
Sure, a couple of different things, and I obviously can't see the graph that you just put up, but I think that I have seen it previous to this, and what I think that particular organization did was, number one, they didn't do any dynamic scoring. If you go look at the details of what they put out, they assumed no benefit to the overall economy, which is just absurd to think that there won't be any
but I'm not talking,
economic
sir, I'm not
benefit
talking about
to the overall
economy. I'm talking about the benefit to the individual
let
family,
me finish.
the tax cut they get.
I got it, but let me go through. You can't look at the tax cut on a family until you realize how much better off they're going to be in a growing economy. But beyond that, they had to make assumptions because we didn't put any in the framework yet about where those particular tax rates kick in. There's nothing in the document yet about that, not because we're hiding it, but because we're working with Congress to try and establish where the different rates kick in. Keep in mind there's 4 rates. There's 0% rate, and we know that will go up to $24,000. After that, it's 12, 25, and 35. But there's been absolutely no decisions made yet on where those percentages kick in terms of the tax brackets. It's impossible to do what the National Tax Center just did. So my guess is, and I think that's the one that Jared Bernstein works for, it's not surprising that the former chief economist for a Democrat vice president doesn't like a Republican tax plan. So I don't put very much weight on that particular study.
It's a nonpartisan group, first of all, sir. And secondly, I mean, you can talk about, well, it's going to kick in at this level or that level, but if the middle-income person is getting a $600 tax cut and the top 1% is getting a $130,000 tax cut, I mean, I thought the whole point was that the wealthy weren't going to get a tax cut at all.
It was, and I'm laughing because I was on one of your. I've done a couple of these interviews this week, Chris, and I was on one of your sister networks, and they were accusing the tax plan of not giving any tax cuts to the wealthy. In fact, they were accusing it of raising the taxes on the wealthy. And then I was on another network, and they were accusing the tax plan of giving all of the benefit to the wealthy. So it sounds like the beauty's in the eye of the beholder at this point. And the real details are this: is that we're looking at the middle class in terms of making sure they can pay less. And this doesn't get nearly enough attention, it's easier for them to pay. Almost 90% of American families, not businesses, but families, actually pay someone else to do their taxes. So there's another benefit we're trying to give to them. The second thing we're trying to add to this is that lower corporate tax rate as we try and spur the economy. So that's where the president's attention is. The president's attention is on the middle class, making sure that's simple, fair, and better, and then on the corporate tax rate to try and get folks to invest in America again. His focus has not been on the impact on the top 1%.
All right, now let's get to the other issue you were discussing, and I interrupted you, and forgive me for that, and that is the issue of cost, because the Senate Republican budget plan calls for a tax cut that is going to cost the Treasury $1.5 trillion over the next 10 years, and some outside experts say that the plan that was unveiled this week actually will add $2 trillion to the debt over the next 10 years. Now, back when you were in Congress, you were a deficit hawk. What happened, sir?
Yeah, and I think that $2 trillion number is coming from that same organization that did not score this dynamically, didn't look at the potential for economic growth.
That's come from a bunch of different groups.
It does, but let's talk about it because I've been very candid about this. We need to have new deficits because of that. We need to have the growth, Chris. If we simply look at this as being deficit neutral, you're never going to get the type of tax reform and tax reductions that you need to get to sustained 3% economic growth. We really do believe that the tax code is what's holding back the American economy. The reason we've been growing at 1.8% for the last 8-10 years, which is way below the historical average, is in large part because of our tax code. It is important to us to get the biggest, broadest tax reduction, tax cut, tax reform that we can possibly get because it's the only way we get back to 3% growth. That's what's driving all of this. How do you get the American economy back on the historical growth rate of 3% and out of these doldrums of 1.8, 1.9 that we had under the previous administration?
I want to pick up on this because some of your fellow colleagues in the Trump administration are not just saying that it's going to unleash massive growth. They are saying more than that. Here is Treasury Secretary Steve Mnuchin this week.
That's $2 trillion of additional revenues. That's $10 trillion of economic activity. And not only will this tax plan pay for itself, but it will pay down debt.
But the fact is, there is no evidence that tax cuts pay for themselves. The Reagan tax cut back in 1981 added $208 billion to the deficit over 4 years. The Bush tax cuts in 2001 and 2003 added $1.5 trillion to the debt over 10 years. Mr. Mulvaney, you can argue whether or not tax cuts spur economic growth. I think that's a perfectly legitimate argument. There is no evidence that they pay for themselves.
Well, just look at the facts, and you can go back, Chris, and make an assumption, and you can run some numbers. You have to make a couple of assumptions about growth rates and so forth. But if we had 3% growth, which is what we're trying to get to, and what we're at, by the way, right now, we're trying to maintain that 3% growth. If we had been at 3% growth over the last 10 years, the budget very nearly would be balanced this year. That's how big a difference it makes when you grow the American economy, that additional 1% over 10 years. Over the next 10 years, if we can grow at 3% instead of the 1.8% that the nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office says that we're going to grow at, and has been the average under the previous administration. If we can get to that 3%, it is $2 to $2.5 trillion worth of more government revenues. It's 12 million additional jobs, and those are 12 million jobs paying into Medicare, 12 million jobs paying into Social Security. Growth really is what's driving all of this, and growth is what our focus is, which is why we're willing to accept increased short-term deficits in exchange for that long-term payoff.
But, I mean, that's the point I want to make, and you seem to be agreeing with me. Growth is a great thing, and there's no question tax cuts can produce growth, although it isn't just tax cuts. In fact, in the 90s, Bill Clinton had a tax increase, and we had the biggest growth we've had in any decade in recent history. So, I mean, there are a lot of other factors, I think you would agree, other than government fiscal policy. But the chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors for Ronald Reagan said that the benefit, the payback from a tax cut is 35 cents on the dollar. So, in other words, he's saying if you cut taxes $1, you add 65 cents to the debt.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I'm not familiar with that math. In fact, I'm sitting here trying to think of how to respond to it. But in any event, there are a lot of other fiscal policies that we have put in place already, Chris, and I don't want to draw attention away from the regulatory reform that we've done. And by the way, why do I talk about these things? We're at 3% already. I think I was on your show a couple months ago, and you had criticisms from some of the same groups saying there was no way that we would get to 3% ever during this administration. And here we are already in the first 8 months. Growth works. What we're doing in the administration to spur growth in terms of regulatory reform work. And what we're working on right now is to make sure that those tax cuts add to that. We do believe that sustained 3% economic growth is possible, and that is the way you can balance the budget long term. Without 3% growth, Chris, you'll never balance the budget at 1.8% growth again. And as the budget director, you asked me an opening question, what happened to me? Why am I now interested in deficits? The only way you balance the budget in this country long term is through sustained economic growth, and that's why everything we are doing in this administration is aimed at that end goal.
Director Mulvaney, thank you. Thanks for sharing part of your weekend with us, especially on a college trip with your son. We'll track the progress of the tax package in Congress. Thanks again, sir.